Yae Miko has been one of the most anticipated units in Genshin history. From her first appearance in the Archon quest, many players were completely sold on the idea of adding Yae to their team, so today on her release day, I'm bringing you the best Yae Miko guide discussing how she works, her best builds, weapons, teams, and more. As a heads up, I was able to get this guide out early thanks to the Genshin Impact Media server, where I was granted an early look at 2.5, so thank you Hoyoverse for that. All of the information in this guide is based on my personal testing in the server, as well as some theory crafting based on media server numbers, so it's just like the rest of my guides, just early. Anyways, I don't want to keep you too long from the guide itself, so with all that being said, my name is Braxophone, and let's talk about everything Yae Miko. Let's get started with some information about Yae's kit. Yae is a sub DPS, or off-field damage dealer, who uses her skill to deal electro damage over condensed intervals, as well as nuke enemies with a high-scaling elemental burst. We all know that Yae's strong personally, but she's too busy girl-bossing to attack for herself, so she makes her fox spirits do it for her, which is probably why her normal attack scaling is so low. Yae's normal attack is a 3-hit combo, and her charged attack is similar to Sara's burst, where it sends a line of electro attacks forward. Now, one cool thing to note about her charged attack is that it can hit the same enemy multiple times if they get knocked backwards into it. So even though the multiplier on her charged attack is pretty low, it can be strong and overload against staggerable enemies. The biggest downside of her charged attack though is that it costs 50 stamina, which is just absurdly high. Now Yae's elemental skill teleports Yae in any direction you're trying to go and summons a totem that acts like a slow firing single target turret for 14 seconds. You can have up to 3 turrets on the field at a time, and her skill itself has 3 charges. Each charge has a 4-second cooldown, and 1 cooldown can be going at a time without using her skill affecting the timer. One turret alone will generate 5 particles during its 14-second duration, but this is mostly just due to an internal cooldown on the skill similar to Ningguang. Hypothetically, you could put down a turret, wait a couple seconds, put down the second one, and get 6 total particles from the 2 of them combined. She does get animation locked, and it can't be cancelled by switching characters, dashing, or using her burst, so once you've used her elemental skill, you're stuck until you've placed the turret. Now in the skill description, it says that if the turrets are too close to each other, one will be destroyed, and I've only had this happen to me once. The turrets have to literally be inside of each other's hitboxes for one of them to disappear. The turret will always appear where she ends up at the end of the animation, so just avoid landing on other turrets and you should be fine. One of the more important things to note is that her turrets have levels that determine how much damage they do with each hit. So a turret's level is based on how many other turrets it's linked to, with a max level of 3 at Constellation 0. Now to get the most damage possible, you should aim to create a triangle with your turrets at all times. Since the range to tether is decently far, you won't really have issues with it. That being said, if you want to stretch out your turret's range, you can opt for a line shape that'll result in 3 level 2 turrets, which does less damage but covers a huge area. But in general, it's faster to just spam her skill and make a triangle anyways, so that's what I'd recommend. Lastly, her turrets can't be destroyed by enemy attacks, and they always will tick once every 3 seconds on their own separate timer. In other words, they do not increase speed when you link them up, even though it might feel like it. And her turrets also do not snapshot stats when they're placed. But that's enough turret talk, now we get to talk about her burst. Yae's elemental burst has the best animation in the entire game, and you can fight me on that one. Her burst costs 90 energy though, so you're gonna have to pay up a lot to see it. It's a fairly high scaling burst that deals an AoE of damage in front of Yae, followed by up to 3 extra hits depending on how many turrets you had out in the field. When you cast her burst, it destroys all of the active turrets on the field at once, and each extra turret hit is a fairly big amount of damage, so it's worth having all of the turrets on the field for her burst, otherwise the damage will be minimal. Its cooldown is decently long at 22 seconds. One thing to mention about her burst is that you can sneak in an extra bit of damage if you use her charged attack first and animation cancel it by activating her burst, since her charged attack will add an extra hit or 2. Once you've unlocked Yae's first Ascension passive, it makes it so that when you cast her burst and turrets are destroyed, you get 1 turret back for each destroyed turret, so essentially you can place 3 turrets, destroy them, and immediately place 3 more. It's an amazing quality of life change that makes playing Miko a lot better. Yae's second Ascension passive increases her turret's damage by 0.15% of her elemental mastery. One cool interaction with this is that Sucrose's Ascension elemental mastery sharing does actually affect this passive and increase Miko's turret damage. In general, this is a nice bit of bonus damage, but it's not something that you should build her for unless you're in an overload comp where you'll see high return on investment for EM. Now for her talent priority, it's safest to level her elemental skill, followed by her elemental burst, followed by her normals if you do plan on having her on field. To level talents, you'll need handguards, light scrolls, and the Meaning of Aeon's Raiden boss material. Now I know that was a ton of information. I wanted to make sure that you guys got all of the info you needed or might have questions about with her kits, so I had to make it a little long, but as always though, feel free to ask questions down in the comments. And with all that being said, let's move on to weapons for Yae. So I did get to test a bunch of weapons with Yae, but I'll also be referencing specific Yae Miko damage calculations to determine which weapons are solid picks as well, since I don't have every single weapon because I'm broke. Also keep in mind that weapon rankings can completely depend on the state of your account, what characters you have, what kind of artifacts you have, how your stats are, so the weapons I recommend for you personally may not actually be the best weapons for you. But just as a general baseline, I'm going to talk about which ones are the best for the average player, including R5 weapons, 5-star weapons, free-to-play weapons, everything. First off, Yae's signature weapon Kagura's Verity is very good on her, as it should be. If you're wondering how good, R1 Kagura's Verity is about 20% more kit damage than R5 Solar Pearl, which would be the next best option for her, assuming that you use one normal attack to activate its passive before you use her burst. With that being said, the Widsith is an amazing weapon in general, and especially at R5, but the biggest issue you'll find is when you actually get the Elemental Mastery passive. Since Yae does get some scaling off of Elemental Mastery, Widsith really isn't that bad, but there is a noticeable drop in damage compared to the Elemental damage and attack buff passives. To be honest, you should be fine with Widsith even with the worst buff, since it's a crit damage main stat weapon, and if you don't have Lost Prayer, Solar Pearl, Skyward Atlas, or Memory of Dust, Widsith is an amazing choice despite its inconsistency. If you're wondering about Blackcliff, that weapon is also fine as a stat stick since it builds a crit damage main stat and makes it easier to finish a crit build for Yae. With all of this information in mind, there are two weapons in particular though that I want to highlight. The first one is Oathsworn Eye, which is a new free-to-play event weapon that'll be available during a section of the 2.5 patch. Oathsworn Eye looks like a solid free-to-play catalyst, but its passive is where it's going to shine for Yae specifically. It's got an attack percent main stat, but its passive grants bonus energy recharge after casting an elemental skill. Since Yae needs a ton of energy to use her burst, Oathsworn will alleviate some of her energy recharge needs and allow you to build less of it on her while still maintaining decent uptime on her burst. As a free-to-play player, though it's not technically the highest damaging weapon on paper, it will be one of Yae's best weapons for accessibility purposes and completely free as long as you participate in the event. The second weapon that I want to talk about is Hakushin Ring, which I know a lot of players were super excited about, and I was too for a little bit. There's a common misconception about Hakushin Ring, which is that its passive can activate while the character holding it is off field. Unfortunately, it will not activate off field, meaning that you can't really take full effect of its elemental damage increase unless your Yae is on the field consistently. For a sub DPS Yae, Hakushin Ring isn't really that amazing. With that being said, if you play Yae as an on-field driver for characters that deal damage off-field that don't snapshot, like Syncchol, Kokomi, Toma, and Raiden, Hakushin Ring can work. Alternatively, if you're willing to swap around a bunch, you can snapshot Hakushin Ring's passive with characters like Fischl, Beidou, and Xiangling. In general though, I would recommend going for one of the weapons I listed before since those are easier to use and more flexible for Yae. If you're free to play and don't have any other options from the gacha and you want to build Yae before Oathsworn comes out, then I'd recommend building Mapamare, which has an Elemental Mastery main stat and grants elemental damage bonus whenever you create an elemental reaction. If you guys want to see the actual numbers behind this, I'm going to be linking a spreadsheet in the description that shows weapon rankings from Yae mains. Unfortunately, the sheet that I was using isn't ready to go public yet, but when it is, I can go ahead and post that as well. Artifacts might be the most simple part of building Yae, since she's a classic case of stats of her sets. What I mean is that most of her sets are close in damage, and that good crit and attack substats could make the difference between what set you should use. For reference, you can combine any two-piece of Gladiator, Shiminawa, Emblem of Severed Fate, Noblesse, and Thundering Fury, and your Yae will deal decent damage. With that being said, I would highly recommend shooting for two-piece Emblem and two-piece Thundering Fury, since by running Thundering Fury, you're going to be getting a 15% electro damage bonus, which applies to your whole kit, and with Emblem, you'll have an easier time reaching Yae's energy recharge threshold of around 150%. With solo Yae Miko, you'll want more energy recharge than this, closer to 200%, but since almost every Yae team will be running double electro, 150% will be fine, and Emblem takes care of 20% of that by default. You also have two solid 4-piece options, with one of them being 4 Emblem of Severed Fate and the other being 4-piece Thunder Soother. 4 Emblem will increase Yae's elemental burst damage by 25% of her energy recharge, meaning you can use her burst as a very powerful nuke and have no trouble getting it back quickly. With that being said though, her elemental skill is a big part of her kit and you'll be losing some turret damage, but it can be worth it in teams where Yae is your only electro. 4-piece Thunder Soother is very good under the right conditions as well, but I need to stress it has to be the right conditions. It'll increase your damage by 35% against enemies that have electro on them, so it will be very good in taser and mono electro, but outside of that, the set is basically useless since you won't be able to maintain an electro aura on your enemies and therefore won't get the buff. So only use this set if you're using an electro charge or mono electro team, otherwise you're not going to get a lot of value. There are more sets that can work, like 2-piece Gamblers for Flower and Feather, 4-piece Wanderer's Troop for on-field DPS, and Tenacity of the Millelith, but in general these sets are either hard to farm or not really worth it compared to the initial sets I listed. And in Tenacity's case specifically, in many teams you won't see a damage gain since unlike Fischl, Yae has a nuke burst that you want to build her for. One last thing about artifact sets, if you do decide to go main DPS as Yae, you can use any of the sets that I mentioned, but I wouldn't recommend it since her attack scalings are low. Ultimately though, the sets don't change. Stats for Miko are fairly simple. You want to get an attack percent Sands, electro damage Goblet, and crit rate or crit damage Circlet. You could substitute your attack Sands in a nuke build with 4-piece Emblem for an energy recharge Sands, but I wouldn't recommend it since with just 2-piece Emblem and decent energy recharge substats, you can still have good burst uptime. Remember, for energy recharge in a team with 2 electro or battery units like Raiden or Fischl, you only need 150% energy recharge to have her burst up fairly often. You can also have more energy recharge than that, I'm just saying the baseline is about 150. Now, a lot of people are wondering if Elemental Mastery is worth building for Yae because of her passive. The short answer to that question is no, since building attack will get you a lot more damage in the end, and there are characters that can passively buff your Elemental Mastery like Sucrose already. Ultimately, the 0.15% is just a bonus to your damage. It's not something you should focus on, at least in a typical Yae Miko build. But the long answer is that if you're going to be using Miko in an overload team, full Elemental Mastery builds can be decent, since a lot of the time, Miko will be the trigger with the slow turret attacks. But generally speaking, I would avoid Elemental Mastery builds because given the current roster of the game and Abyss enemies, it can be pretty difficult to set up an overload team, and Elemental Mastery builds in Electrocharge teams just aren't that great. For substats, you want to focus on energy recharge until you get to 150%, but after that you can look at crit damage, crit rate, attack percent, and elemental mastery. Now with crit rate and crit damage, you want to make sure that you have a 1-to-2 ratio of crit rate to crit damage, so you're looking at least 50 crit rate to 100 crit damage, and that's when you can call your build solid. After that, you can still improve. You can always go up to like 70 crit rate, 140 crit damage, but 50-100 is the baseline. So now we're going to talk about teams, and in this section I've compiled 4 teams that I've found to be solid from personal testing. That being said, new teams get discovered all the time, even for older characters, and the team recommendations I'm going to make aren't the end-all be-all. There are tons of ways to run every character in the game, and these are just 4 strong suggestions. With all that being said, the first team that I'm going to showcase is Taser, which is a comp that utilizes Sucrose, Fischl, and Xingqiu. The idea with this team is that Sucrose is going to swirl both Electro and Hydro to debuff enemy resistances and increase your team's damage output, while Xingqiu will add stagger resistance, a bit of healing, and a lot of damage to the mix. Fischl exists to output a ton of electro damage and battery Yae, and she can also use Tenacity of the Millelith to buff Yae and Xingqiu since neither of them snapshot. You can equip Sucrose with Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers, Hakushin Ring, or Sacrificial Fragments, and all of them are going to be super solid options. In this setup, Sucrose can also be used to group enemies for Miko's burst as well. Overall, this team is super easy to play and really solid. Now I like to call this next team Mommy, but you can call it Mono Electro. This team features Raiden, Yae, Sara, and Jean. Ideally here, you're taking advantage of Viridescent Veteran on Jean to lower enemy electro resistance, as well as Sara's large amount of buffs she can output. Raiden batteries the entire team, as well as provides high damage, and Sara and Yae both deal high burst damage as well. On top of that, Raiden increases burst damage for the entire team based on energy costs, so Yae's burst sees a 25% burst damage bonus. This team is really solid and just feels powerful when you play it. Also, you can replace Sara with Eula for a variant on the Eula carry team as well, and it'll still be pretty good. Alternatively, you could replace Jean with Kazuha for even more electro damage, and you could argue actually that the Kazuha variant is the original variant, but I like to play Jean because you get some heals out of it. The third team I want to showcase is the Foul Legacy Child team replacing Beidou with Yae. It's similar to Taser, but you'll be using Child's melee stance to drive reactions. With Sucrose to debuff enemies as usual, you'll deal a lot of electro and hydro damage, and the team ends up just being super solid for AoE scenarios. Funny enough, even with 2 single target damage dealers in the same team, its single target damage is on the lower end since Child's melee stance damage really excels in AoE with Riptide, but less so against one enemy. You can also replace Child with Yoimiya for great single target damage, and you could always replace Sucrose with Bennett at any time. Now the 4th team I found might be kind of controversial, but it's pretty good. It's actually Sukokomon with Fischl subbed for Yae. The rest of the team is Sucrose, Kokomi, and Xiangling if you've never heard Sukokomon before, and the idea is that it deals so many different reactions and so much damage at once from the main characters that it'll chip away at enemy health very fast. Now it is worth noting that Sukokomon becomes significantly more powerful with the correct rotation, and Yae will change that rotation a fair bit, but but the team is still pretty strong in general, just because of, like I said, it has a lot of reactions going on. A weapon like Hakushin Ring here wouldn't actually be so bad with Yae as a driver, assuming that you can snapshot the pyro damage buff with Xiangling. Alternatively, you can use Sucrose to drive, or you could use Kokomi with Thrilling Tales. You have lots of different options for who can use what catalyst here, but Yae does fit in fairly well because she has a lot of damage from her electro turrets. And especially with Hakushin Ring, you can actually snapshot the pyro damage bonus on Xiangling, and you're also buffing Kokomi and Yae since they have dynamic stats. They're not snapshotting anything. Overall, it can be a good combo. Now, I want to reiterate that these 4 teams aren't the end-all be-all teams for Yae. They're just 4 that I found to be really strong. It's possible that stronger teams will be found with the arrival of new characters. I also just want to add that when Spiral Abyss 12 isn't all unmovable boss enemies, Venti and Yae is a disgusting combo that deletes enemies in seconds with no effort at all, since her turrets and bursts can both reach Venti's lift. Infusing Venti with Pyro will also allow Miko to trigger overloads, and it's just an insane combo. You have to try it if you have both of them. Lastly, Zhongli and Bennett can fit into almost any of these teams for another support like Sucrose, and the teams would still be solid as well. If you're like me, you want to know if a character's constellations are game-changing or worth going for, even if you don't end up getting constellations. So real quickly, before we wrap up the video, I want to explain why certain constellations are good or bad, and talk about whether or not going for her weapon or constellations will be better. First off, Yae's Constellation 1 refunds some of Yae's energy when you use her burst. You'll get 8 energy back for every turret you destroy. For example, if you have 3 turrets up and you use her burst, you'll get 24 energy back. It's a very strong quality of life change since it effectively makes her burst a 66 cost, which indirectly improves her damage by letting you run less energy recharge on her. Yae's Constellation 2 upgrades the level of every turret by 1 by default, meaning unlinked turrets will be level 2 and the max level your turrets can be will be 4. It also increases turret range by 60%, which again is a big quality of life improvement. The level 4 turret upgrade is pretty significant to Yae's off-field damage, giving her about a 12% increase to total DPS. Constellation 3 increases her elemental skill by 3 levels, which is roughly another 9% damage increase. Constellation 4 is an insanely good support utility that increases your party's electro damage whenever one of Yae's turrets deals damage. It gives everyone 20% electro damage for 5 seconds, which doesn't seem long, but the turrets will repeatedly attack to refresh the timer. This constellation ends up being around a 12% damage increase as well. Yae's Constellation 5 increases Yae's burst level by 3, and Constellation 6 makes Yae's turrets ignore 60% of enemy defense, increasing overall damage by around 25%. In total, theory crafters have calculated that a C6 Yae with Widsith and no passive at all gets a 120% damage gain over Constellation 0. Yae's constellations are very strong, and you will definitely get your bang for your buck if you're deciding to wail on her. That being said, there are better C6 characters, and as always, I don't recommend going for constellations on a character if you're free to play, since often having a new unit instead can be more fun or better for your account. A lot of players are wondering if they should go for her weapon or constellation, so here is my completely subjective opinion. Yae Constellation 1 is an amazing quality of life change, but in general it's not necessary to play the character. Constellation 2 is similar, except it offers damage as well. You can't really go wrong going for constellations on her. Meanwhile, Yae's weapon isn't exceptional for every character. It's not bad at all, it has good stats regardless of whether or not a character can get full stacks if it's passive, but it's not so flexible that you'd use it on everyone if you had other options. That being said, considering the weapon banner that it's on, you also have a chance to get Jade Cutter, which is easily the number 1 or 2 best sword in the game. If you don't have Jade Cutter and you want Miko's weapon, then you can't lose on the weapon banner outside of the 75-25. Worst case for raid ups, you get Jade Cutter, and best case scenario, you get Miko's weapon. If it were another weapon that isn't as solid as Jade Cutter, I would argue that Yae Constellations are a better choice, but because the secondary weapon is Jade Cutter, I would argue that the weapon banner is actually a safer bet this time around. That being said, this section is all my opinion, and you don't have to agree with it. That's just my personal perspective on the value of both. Alright, so now that my 2-hour documentary on Yae is coming to a close, I just wanted to reiterate a couple of things. If you want my full review on Yae, that'll be a separate video since there's a lot to talk about, but in general, I think she's a balanced unit. She's definitely not game-changing at Constellation 0, but she can dish out solid damage and is usable in some powerful comps like Taser. Once you get to around 150% energy recharge with her, she'll be nice and cozy to play. She pairs extremely well with Raiden as well, so if you have a well-built Fischl or Raiden, Miko is a pretty good pickup. That being said, again, watch my review video video if you want my opinion on exactly how good she is from a meta perspective, because she has pros and cons to her play, as do most other characters. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching this far. I really wish I could have made this video shorter, but there was just so much information to talk about that I didn't want to leave anything out. If you've enjoyed, I would greatly appreciate if you'd leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and let me know if you're excited for Yae in the comments below. Thanks everyone, and I'll catch you later.